So thanks so much for having me here. It's really bittersweet because I view Jay kind of like a brother in many ways. Jay was a marine biologist, but Jay cared very deeply about neurobiology. Anyone who read The Blue Mind could say, wait a second, is he a marine biologist or is he a neuroscientist? And Jay threaded those two disciplines better than anyone I've ever seen. And so when I met Jay, it was about 10 years ago. He had just released Blue Mind. I think it was 2014. And he heard that I was opening up a laboratory that was going to focus on trying to understand what happens when your brain is floating in water. And he said, wait a second, I need to know this guy. And he invited me to the first Blue Mind Summit. This was the first one I went to, I think, was in 2015, so the year after Blue Mind came out. And this was in Washington, D.C. Was anyone at that Blue Mind Summit in D.C. back in 2015? So that was my first time meeting Jay in person. And he wanted me to present on this idea of flotation therapy. And I was really looking at this as a natural intervention that doesn't require any drugs to help people with serious clinical anxiety. And no one had ever studied this before. And when I say flotation therapy or flotation-REST, it's a very specific type of float therapy. It's different than, say, going in the ocean. There's overlap, but there's differences, and we're going to go through those today. But the REST stands for Reduced Environmental Stimulation Therapy. And this is a key part of the intervention. You're trying to minimize stimulation on the nervous system. And we go out of our way to sort of systematically design these float pools in order to do so. And the neat part is when I presented in 2015, this was just an idea. We had just finished building the laboratory that I was working at in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was at the Laureate Institute for Brain Research. And I was also affiliated with the University of Tulsa. And here I am basically a decade later, and now this research has all been published. It's out there in the world. And if any of you are interested, my nonprofit has a website that has a repository of all the peer-reviewed studies that have been published on this. And there's been quite a few over the past decade. And we're going to go through some of those. But to me, the neat part of coming here is we actually now have quantifiable data of what the Blue Mind looks like. And I'm going to show it to you today. And I wish Jay could be here to see this because I know it would have really lit him up. I mean, this is what he lived for, right? And hopefully the sun will cooperate and you'll be able to see some of the images of the Blue Mind state. So let's start with Jay himself. Really, the best way to understand Blue Mind is to start with what I call Red Mind. And that's our new normal. We're stressed, we're anxious, we're falling behind in many aspects of our lives, we're distracted, we've got this technology everywhere we look. We dive into a melee of input, of sensory overload, and it takes its toll on us. Jay picked up on this quite early. This was, smartphones when Blue Mind was published had only been around for a few years, but now we could all testify to how we're inundated by stimulation from the outside world. And what we don't recognize is the human species wasn't prepared for this inundation of stimulation. We need to give our nervous system a break. And that is really what the idea of floating is it provides a respite from all this stimulation. So let's get into the brain. This is the cortical surface of our brain. And so much of what the outside surface of the brain is doing is it's trying to process and make sense of this world around us. And so when this brain is inside of a well-calibrated float pool, this is what it looks like. All forms of external sensory input are minimized. Everything from vision and sound, to proprioception, which is the sense of your body in space, to tactile sensation, to speech, to movement. So it doesn't take a neuroscience to realize, you don't have to have a degree in neuroscience, to see that when you're in a float environment, you're affecting a lot of cortical real estate. And it's a very profound intervention for sort of reducing stimulation on our brain and nervous system. On top of that, we heat the water to the temperature of your skin. It's about 94, 95 degrees. It's a few degrees cooler than your core temperature. And we heat the air to the temperature of the water. So there's no thermoregulation. It doesn't feel too hot. It doesn't feel too cold. It feels right in the middle. It's totally neutral. And then let's not forget, the brain doesn't live in a vacuum. There's the tail of the brain, the spinal cord. And every single moment of the day, that's being pushed down by the forces of gravity, right? And in a float environment, even gravity is reduced. So when I started thinking about flotation therapy with people who have anxiety, the first thing I thought about is just looking at this picture kind of made me a little bit anxious. I was like, wait a second, how are we going to get people with severe anxiety to engage in this therapy? And so we really looked outside the box to figure out how could we actually make this accessible to people who need it. And if you were to say Google the word float tank now, typically what you'll see out there are these very small enclosed chambers, highly claustrophobic, and any of the patients I worked with would probably never even get foot inside of one. So what we had to build was completely different. It's what I call an open flotation pool, and this is what it looks like. It's an 8-foot circular pool, wide open, no enclosure whatsoever. This is very important. In that pool is a foot of water, but in that foot of water is 2,000 pounds of Epsom salt. So we are now denser than the Dead Sea. It's a mattress of water. People fall asleep in it all the time. It will hold every single muscle of your body up. On top of that, we build this room around the pool to be soundproof, lightproof, and temperature and humidity controlled. And by virtue of doing that, you don't need an enclosure. You could have the same exact calibration as one of those small enclosed chambers, but in a wide open space. And then the final thing we did is we wanted to give the patients full control over the experience, so they could have the lights on or off. In fact, we created an infrared wave system, so if you want to turn the lights on while you're floating, you just wave your arm in the air and the lights go on and off. So the idea is by doing this, you could actually reduce the barriers to entry. And a lot of the anxious patients would come into the experience feeling a little bit anxious, and then they would come into the room and they'd look at the pool and they'd say, wait a second, I could do that. And that's, I think, a real important part of floating. Right now, a lot of the centers are doing these enclosed pools, but what we've been doing is these open float pools. And I think that's a real game changer in terms of making it more accessible. The other thing that we had to work with is this notion that people have referred to as sensory deprivation. And a lot of times when you hear that word, it's scary. But I actually think it's a misnomer for the experience. And I'll get into that in a second here. So when we first started this research, the general thesis was if you could reduce all of this stimulation on the nervous system, after an hour of floating, you would basically create more or less a reset. Somebody who's stressed or anxious would suddenly not feel that anymore. But going back to that idea of sensory deprivation, what we were finding in our initial studies was this was the exact opposite. It was actually enhancing your internal senses. This is a concept that is known in neuroscience as interoception, which is how does the brain feel the inside of the body? How does it feel the visceral systems of the body? And this is actually what comes to life while you're floating. So I never like to use that word sensory deprivation because, in fact, what we're finding is you could actually enhance the internal senses while you're floating. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, we had these little somatomaps where people would trace where they feel their heartbeat before the float, and then afterwards they would trace where they felt their heartbeat during the float. And it kind of creates this almost stethoscope-like effect where while you're floating, you could actually feel and hear your own heart beating. But it's not just the heartbeat. You also see it with the breath. And what we did is when we looked at people's report of their the intensity of the internal sensations and how much they were paying attention to them, it was both the heartbeat and the breath that were sort of becoming the center of conscious awareness. And a lot of the patients reported a spontaneous induction of a meditative state. We weren't telling them to focus on the heartbeat or breath. The environment was naturally doing it. So the next time someone tries to tell you that floating is a form of sensory deprivation, come back to this and say, no, it's not. It's enhancing your connection with your internal body. And I think this is an important part of the therapeutic effect. So when I started doing this research in 2014, there had never been a single study published on people with clinical anxiety and flotation therapy. And so we were quite concerned, is this going to help people or is it going to make them better? And this was actually the results from our first study that was published in 2018. We had 50 people with pretty severe anxiety, and this was all forms of anxiety. We had people with post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, panic disorder, agoraphobia. We kind of spanned the whole spectrum. And what you see is a very reliable pre to post float reduction in state anxiety. This is actually a 14-point drop on the Spielberger State Anxiety Inventory. And what's really interesting to me is when you compare this group of 50 anxious patients to a sample of people who did not have anxiety and they were floating, you could actually see their anxiety levels drop down quite a bit into normative healthy levels. So it wasn't just reducing their anxiety a little bit, but it was actually getting them into a much healthier baseline state. And it didn't matter what their condition was, what type of anxiety they were suffering from. It didn't matter if they were male or female. In fact, the people with the most severe anxiety going into the experience had the best effect. So this was really powerful result. This was the first result that we published. And you could actually quantify how big of an effect it was using this Cohen's d metric. And essentially, any Cohen's d above 0.8 is considered a large effect. So in that first study, we actually hit it out of the park. It was a giant effect size for anxiety reduction. And since this study was published, we've now replicated this in 5 more studies. And some of these were randomized controlled trials. This looked at a whole slew of different populations. So the first couple studies here were all patients with anxiety or PTSD. We also looked at this in women who had pretty severe anorexia nervosa, and anorexia nervosa is actually one of the most severe forms of anxiety that you'll get. This particular sample was made up of inpatients, people who were living at the hospital because they were so severely impaired. And we also saw it in chronic pain patients. And when you look at, on average, what the state anxiety reduction was across all these studies, it was about a 14-point drop on the Spielberger. So this was pretty neat for me because this was the original study, but we've now been able to replicate it over 5 times. And this got me excited because this is what you want to see in any sort of therapeutic medicine, that wherever you do it, with whatever population you do it with, there's going to be a benefit. And that's exactly what we were seeing. We didn't want to just look at during the float itself. We wanted to see how long do these anti-anxiety effects last. And so after the float, we would ping the patients and try to figure out how long was this actually lasting. And what we found is it was going into the next day. So it wasn't just reducing people's anxiety at the moment of the float, but there was some sort of a carryover effect. And then last year, I don't have it here, but last year we published a follow-up study to show that the effects actually persevered for 48 hours. So it wasn't just lasting a single day, it was actually going into the day after. And I think this is very important because right now, if you were to go to your doctor and tell them that you suffer from extreme anxiety, you're having trouble sleeping, you can't shut your mind off, more likely than not, that doctor is going to hand you a prescription for a highly addictive drug like a benzodiazepine. And one of the classic anti-anxiety benzos is Xanax, right? If you were to pop a Xanax right now, your anxiety would go down just like this, but around 4 hours or 8 hours afterwards, the anxiety would percolate back. And the fact that we were seeing effects that were lasting 48 hours means we were actually doing better than the classic benzodiazepines. So I think this is very powerful. And it wasn't just reducing anxiety. There was clearly this enhancement of mental wellness. A lot of the patients reported this very profound state of relaxation. About 75% of our sample said this was single-handedly the most relaxing experience they've ever had in life. And when you look at what was actually reducing even more than anxiety, it was muscle tension. And when you think about all the tension we harbor in our muscles, this could be a very big contributory factor for what's driving our anxiety. And so we looked at muscle tension. We actually had a study where people were watching a film, which was the BBC Earth. So it was a very relaxing, sort of fun documentary to watch about nature. And when you have them trace where they're feeling muscle tension pre-film or post-film, most of us feel muscle tension in the skeletal muscles surrounding our spinal cord, in our lower back and in our neck. Same exact sort of finding pre-float, but what was interesting is when you ask people what it was like during the float, all of that muscle tension just dissipated away. And I think this is a very important intervention because so much of mental health is trying to focus on what's happening in the head. But this is one of the few interventions that's actually impacting the body itself. And it's not just the skeletal muscles that are in the spinal cord region. I think it's also impacting the smooth muscles that are in every single blood vessel in our body. And one of the ways that we test the so-called tension of those muscles is one of the most important health indicators on earth. It's blood pressure. And when you look at blood pressure while somebody is floating, you see this precipitous drop of 10 to 15 points, especially in the diastolic blood pressure. And this wasn't trivial. I could tell you, to measure things during a float, you have a lot of salt and a lot of water, and any type of electrical equipment will not like either of those things. So we broke a ton of equipment trying to do this, but we finally figured out how to use very tiny, waterproof, and wireless equipment. And really, the biggest effect that we're seeing out of all the physiological variables is a very precipitous drop in blood pressure. And we saw this in every single person we've ever tested. So what happens in the brain? It turns out we really didn't know because there had never been any studies looking at it. But we had a great opportunity to publish a study that was the first time anyone had ever done an MRI scan before and after floating. This came out just a couple years ago in Human Brain Mapping. And for the first time, we got a sense of what is actually happening in the circuitry of the brain while somebody is floating. And the way we set this up is everyone would get an initial MRI scan, and then they would be randomized to either float 3 separate times or rest in a zero gravity chair as a control condition. And then immediately after their 3rd session, they would have a second MRI scan. So we're really looking at what's happening in the brain from before to after these float sessions or these zero gravity chair sessions. And I think every session in this study was about 90 minutes long. And one of the biggest findings we found in this study involves something known as the default mode network. Anyone ever heard of that term, the default mode? So it turns out we only discovered this a couple decades ago, but when the brain is doing nothing, when you're not being stimulated, when you're at rest, you have this set of regions in the brain called the default mode that is alive and active. This set of regions is really what people often refer to as your mind chatter, right? That voice in your head that won't go away. Well, it turns out these collections of regions in both the frontal and the posterior sections of the brain, the default mode network, were shutting off post-float. And just to give you an example of one of the findings in this study, we found a specific area of the prefrontal cortex in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And when you look at what happens from pre to post float, in this particular region, you see this dramatic decrease in blue here of the default mode network. So it's actually decreasing in connectivity from pre to post float. When you look at that same exact set of regions after the zero gravity chair control condition, you're not seeing those changes. It seems to be very specific to being immersed in the flotation environment. You could actually sort of classify the different regions that are changing. Here in pink are all the default mode networks. Here in green are actually all the somatosensory cortices. These are the regions of the brain that are processing your body, both the muscle tension in your body, but also that internal body, that visceral body. These were the regions that were decreasing in connectivity. And what you see is in both conditions, chair rest or float rest, you see a decrease in connectivity both within and between these regions of the brain. But in flotation rest, you see a much bigger decrease. So it's definitely impacting these very important networks in our brain. When you try to summarize these results, I think there's a couple interesting conclusions. One is, even though the float environment reduces many different senses of your outside world, such as sight and sound, the biggest changes that we're seeing in the brain were actually the areas of the brain that map your body. And I think this is an important part of what floating is doing inside the brain itself. And when we actually looked at these somatosensory cortex areas, everything from the basic primary somatosensory cortex to the posterior insula, which is really more involved in processing the heart and the breath, what you see is the greater you decrease the connectivity in these regions from pre to post float, the greater that experience of post float serenity. So I actually think that the way floating is cleansing the mind is actually through the body. And this is a key part of the findings. Now, one limitation that you may have picked up on is we were only looking at changes from pre-float to post-float. And obviously, there's a residue that carries forward for at least a day or two. So you're still capturing some of it. But we don't actually know what was happening in the brain during the float itself because there's no MRI scanner that is compatible with the float tank, at least not yet. So we did another study where we were trying to figure out what is actually happening in the brain during the float itself. And once again, we had to get lucky with equipment. And there's a company, a small startup company in San Diego called Neuroverse, that made these really cool wireless EEG monitors that just kind of plop right on your forehead. And then we would have to wrap it in Tegaderm to make sure that no water could actually get in. Even one drop of water, the signal was ruined, I promise you. So it was not easy to do this. But the neat part is we were, for the first time, able to measure the quote-unquote blue mind state during the float itself. And the way this experiment was set up is, once again, you're either going to be in a float environment for 90 minutes, or you're going to be watching that neutral documentary, the BBC Earth, for the same amount of time. The beginning of the float, there's this acclimation period, and then at the end, we turn on some music to sort of, gradually bring people out of it. So The part that we're going to be looking at is this middle section from basically 10 minutes all the way to about 80 minutes, that middle 70 minutes where you're actually not doing anything but floating. And this, my friends, is the blue mind state. So this was a group of anxious patients, some with post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're contrasting what's happening to their brain waves between the float and the film condition. And there's a couple points here that I want to emphasize. The first thing is on the y-axis, this is how fast your brain is fluctuating. At the top, we're talking about 32 cycles a second, okay? At the bottom, it goes down all the way to just 1 cycle a second. And when brain is active, typically in day-to-day life, you're in these higher frequencies. But what you see here in blue shows you that all of these high frequency brain states actually calm down during the float. And this was a very dramatic drop, highly significant drop in high frequency brain waves. But what you actually see here at the bottom are the brain waves that are actually increased during flotation therapy. And when you look at this area of red, the biggest increase is between 1 to 2 hertz. That means your brain is fluctuating at the lowest possible level. If you went any lower, you're basically dead. And the only other time that you're alive and your brain is fluctuating at that low frequency is when you're in a state of deep non-REM sleep. So that's the only other time. And normally there, you're not conscious. So this is very unique to be awake and conscious and floating and have your brain fluctuating at such a low baseline rate. And what this shows me is this is a very profound intervention for reducing all of that arousal and stress in the nervous system. And you don't see this in too many other interventions. Maybe wait. Yeah. When we look at healthy individuals who are not anxious, you see a similar pattern of findings, but not quite as strong and powerful as in the anxious brain. So once again, it really seems like it's impacting people with stress and anxiety in a more profound way than just a healthy, normal brain. So, this has actually not been published yet, you guys. You're one of the first people to see this. But if Jay was here, I would point out to him that this really is the blue mind state. And I hope you guys could see the importance of this, because it was the first demonstration of what is actually happening in the brain while you're in this aqueous environment. So after I collected all these data, I think it was around 2020, the pandemic had just hit. And I looked at my wife with that deer in headlight look of my 2 young children coming home from school and saying, how am I supposed to homeschool these kids for the next few years? And it was really a tough moment because I had my laboratory in Tulsa, Oklahoma, but at the same time I knew I had to step up and help with the family. And so we decided to move to Maui in 2020. And this was mainly because my parents had actually moved there about 12 years ago. So we had been going over the summers. And it wasn't that hard of a transition because, as you guys know, Oklahoma has no ocean. I was landlocked and I was suffering. So I was very happy to move to Maui. But fast forward to last year, and we had one of the worst fires that have ever hit America. It was the deadliest fire. Over 100 people died. Over 10,000 people lost their home. Almost 10% of the island. And living on Maui for the past 4 years, you realize that the people who were hit hardest were the indigenous population. These were multi-generational families that had been living there their whole lives. They didn't have a lot before the fire. They were barely scraping by on the island. And then after the fire, they lost everything. And on top of that, you're in rural America when you're out in the middle of the Pacific like that. We don't have much health care there, and we certainly don't have much of an infrastructure for mental health. And so as soon as the fires hit, I had a nonprofit called the Float Research Collective. And the whole goal of the nonprofit was, how do we get floating approved as a medical treatment so that it could be accessible to the people who actually need it, the people with anxiety, the people with PTSD. But when the fires hit Maui, my first thought was, how could we pivot the nonprofit and get a complete focus on getting float therapy to Maui ASAP? There wasn't a single place to float on the island, which I thought was incredible in terms of, the well-calibrated float environment I was talking about. And the closest place to float was actually another island, Kauai, that was charging $200 a session. And once again, just to emphasize this point, I was on a call last week with a bunch of other medical doctors on Maui. A lot of the fire survivors cannot even afford to pay their copay right now. That's how bad it is. So even charging $5 would create a barrier to entry. So I created a project, it's called the Maui Calm Project. And the whole idea is, how could we get floating to the fire survivors as quick as possible? And that's exactly what we're going to be doing. To me, the hardest part was, we got to do this for free. We can't charge anything. And the other hard part is, if you try to build a brick and mortar flotation facility, it would probably take about 2 to 3 years on Maui with the permitting, with all the construction process. And we needed this facility right now. In fact, I wanted to try to get it to Maui in the first few months of the fire. And we've been fundraising ever since the fires. And if you guys want to know more about this project, we do have a website now. It's mauicalm.org. And you can learn all about this project that we're creating. But the way we were going to get this to the island is very different. It's never been done before. And we're going to do this through shipping containers. So as soon as the fires hit Maui, I called my engineers in England who built my laboratory in Tulsa. And I said to them, we have quite a task in front of us. I need to get float therapy here. It needs to be as quick as possible. How could we do this? And we ended up devising a plan where we would build it inside of shipping containers. It's going to be completely ADA accessible, so one of the rooms is going to be ADA. Once again, we're using open float pools. These are going to be rectangular open float pools. And each room will have its own private open float pool and shower. And the facility is actually going to have 3 different private rooms, each with their own open float pool. And then at the far end here, this is where we have all of our disinfection equipment. So it's pretty neat because for the first time, we could actually rapidly deploy this to Maui. And I found out last week, we're going to have this right in the heart of Lahaina. I'm teaming up with the YMCA, who's building an emergency hub. And they're going to have this on the property of the emergency hub, right really where all the fire survivors are located. And this is the actual shipping container that we bought in England. It's a special side entry container. But when it gets here, it's going to look more like this. And each container will have 3 private open float pools. But the neat part is, at capacity, we could be floating 300 people a week and over 15,000 people a year. And there's really 3 primary aims that we hope to achieve with this project. And the neat part is, because we're a research-based nonprofit, we're going to be collecting all these data and trying to publish this. So the first aim is very simple. Can we reduce the high level of stress and anxiety that the people of Maui are currently experiencing? And this is not just the fire survivors. We're talking about all the first responders, the firefighters, the police force. We're talking about the frontline workers. I deal with a lot of the mental health professionals on the island, and I could tell you they've been vicariously traumatized by this. There's a ton of burnout right now on the island. So that's really our first aim, is just, can we try to reduce some of that stress and anxiety? The second aim, and this is the part that I think is most exciting for me as a clinician, is can we actually use this to prevent PTSD and all its common comorbidities from spiraling into a chronic state. You know, I used to work at the San Diego VA hospital many years ago, and I remember dealing with chronic PTSD. I actually had a World War II veteran that I would see, and he was still having nightmares every single night, waking up in a cold sweat from a trauma that happened over 6 decades ago. And that's what happens with post-traumatic stress when it's not addressed. It could carry on your entire life. And so what I'd love to be able to show is that the people who are using this float therapy on a regular basis could actually stop chronic PTSD from spiraling and becoming a lifelong state. And if that's true, what I really like about this is it's a scalable solution for addressing real-world traumas and disasters. And if we could publish these data and show people like FEMA that this is a very good way of dealing with trauma in the real world, the next time a natural disaster like this happens, or a hurricane, or a conflict in our world, you could go into those disaster zones with a half dozen of these containers behind you, and you could float the whole population right away from the moment of trauma. So those are our aims. They are grandiose, but you have to, I think, do this because right now, the way our society deals with trauma is we try to medicate it away. And that's exactly what I don't want to see happen on Maui. I don't want to see the entire population become addicted to these very, very addictive drugs. And right now, this is aspirational, but about a month ago, it no longer became aspirational because we got a major grant. The Hawaii Community Foundation, which runs the Maui Strong Fund, listened to my pleas, and after a 10-month-long grant review, they said, we are going to fund this completely free of charge for everybody on Maui. So I really wish Jay could have been around to hear that news. To me, the accessibility is the key. And for the first time, we're going to be able to do this and really look at what are the ripple effects when somebody gets to use this service on a regular basis. And we're going to let people float every day if the schedule allows for it. So this is a really neat project. I'm so excited that it's almost to the finish line. It's being built right now in England, and the goal is we're going to have it on Maui by the end of this year. And I always felt that water is an antidote to fire. And it turns out that it's already being used in the real world in firefighters. The International Association of Firefighters has a center of excellence in Washington, D.C., and Abby Morris, who is the medical director there, has been treating firefighters who've been traumatized by a fire, are on disability, they can no longer work. They're flying out to Washington, D.C., and she is actually floating all of them, and she's having great success. So I think there's already real-world evidence that this is going to be helpful. A lot of you may know this already, but Jay encountered a horrible fire trauma back in 2020. The CZU lightning fire in California destroyed his home that he built with his own hands. And it happened the day after his daughter Grace left for college. And Jay wrote a book. I encourage you all to read it. It's called Dear Wild Child. I read it to my daughter every day. And it talks about him having to explain to his daughter that he lost his home. And this is all that was left of Jay's home, just the chimney. This is his other daughter, Julia. And I think what we have to recognize is these fire traumas are very devastating. They take everything. And in Jay's case, it really did. it took his home, which I think really affected him. Before I flew out here for this event, I was in the ocean and a honu, a turtle, came up to me. And I'm pretty sure it was Jay. He's still with us. So I think, getting together like this is a way to honor his life, his legacy. He's given us so much, and we now have the torch. He passed that baton to us, and now we have to run with it, and we have to pass this on to the next generation. I think everything we're doing here, whether it's surf therapy, whether it's float therapy, it doesn't matter. This key ingredient of water is so essential to healing. And that's what Jay really illuminated for all of us. And he wanted to see this carry forward. He desperately wanted to. A week before Jay died, he texted me this picture. It's him and his wife, Dana, and they had just gotten out of a float session. And my God, he looks so happy, doesn't he? And that's the Jay I'll always remember. So, a year ago, Jay decided to honor me for all of the work I'd done trying to understand the Blue Mind, and he passed along the annual Blue Mind Award, and it's one of the greatest honors I had to receive this award, and this was the 7th annual Blue Mind Award that had been given out since he started it. The 6th annual Blue Mind was won by a Blue health coach named Lizzie Larbalister. She lives in southern England, and I was on the phone with Lizzie last week. And she wants to see this award continue forward in honor of Jay, in honor of the Blue Mind. And so we have a very special announcement to make here in front of you for the 2024 Blue Mind Award winner, and we're going to do it right now on stage. I think all of you might know this person, but I just met her, and I have to be honest, I'm blown away by everything she has done. She's created an organization and really fostered its growth, and all of you are here today as a consequence of that. It turns out she's also Hawaiian. Her origins are from Maui. Her great-grandparents are part of a royal family, the Pialani family. Every day I drive around Maui, I drive on a highway called Pialani Highway. Well, it turns out this is her grandparents. And I think there's really no better ambassador for this concept of Blue Mind. So please, everybody, give me a warm round of applause for the 2024 Blue Mind Award, Chris Primazio. So, I'm handing Chris the key to the award.
What?
Hold on. Hold on. Now you have to open the box and reveal the award to everybody.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So everyone knows the blue marble.
Whoa.
I'm going to let you
Oh my gosh.
hold up the ultimate blue marble. And Chris is now going to be part of a new board that has been formed that is going to contain all of the Blue Mind Award winners from the past decade. And each year we are going to meet and determine who the next winner is so this could continue its journey around the globe. So thank you so much for allowing me to come here. This was one of Jay's final requests before he passed. He wanted me to be at this event. He wanted Chris to be the winner of this award. That was actually the final words in my last phone call with Jay. He had two things to tell me. He says, Justin, whatever you do, don't give up on the Maui Calm Project. It's going to work. And Chris is the next Blue Mind Award winner. So I'll stop there and happy to answer questions, but I do want to celebrate Chris for this great achievement.
I'll just say real quick.
Ooh, unexpected. I guess the only thing I can say is I had the great honor of seeing one of Jay's last webinars, and something that he said I wrote down, and so this is from Jay. Please wish people water whenever you get a chance, because it means gratitude, love, peace, freedom, dignity, creativity, courage, and romance. And that's what you're wishing when you wish someone water. So I wish you water, and everybody deserves Blue Mind Awards, so thank you. Okay, so we've got some time for dessert, about 45 minutes, and of course we got to do dessert because I have a sweet tooth. This incredible human being who I've had an opportunity to get to know over the last several months, I'm sure there's a million questions, so please, he's staying. He's not leaving. Come grab him, grab a drink, grab some dessert, and yeah, I mean, there might be a line waiting to talk to you. But Justin, this is incredible. You know, I have family who lost their home in Maui, and actually, Ryan, I'm stoked you're still here because Ryan has done incredible work with getting essential products, needs, everything to Maui, like immediately. Like Ryan's social media was 1,000% focused on getting what they needed, including generators, I obviously follow Ryan like a crazy person, but including essentials. So everything that the Maui people needed, and Ryan could attest to this, so ask Ryan while we're eating dessert, but a lot of my family and a lot of people, they couldn't get just the basics, toothbrushes. They couldn't get anything. Inhalers, like medical, float. So, between Justin and Ryan and talking about Maui, but what you're doing, of course, for my people and for lots, thank you so much. You're incredible. Thank you, and congratulations. We're done. Day 1, done, check. Actually, for some of us, day 4. Yes, eat dessert, please. We've got this stay area for about almost an hour. Enjoy. Thanks, everybody.